Let's now bring in former U.S. Navy JAG officer Don Brown. Don, thank you so much for joining us this morning. What do you make of this? And I'd like you to specifically give us some thoughts on Susan Collins' defection. Are we seeing some breaking of the ranks and some fractures now within Republicans, especially in Congress?
Well, thank you, Bo. No, I really, when you look at Susan Collins, she's under a lot of heat in Maine. There's a radical Democrat who has a Nazi tattooed on his arm that the Democrats are jumping behind and putting a lot of pressure on her. She has a history of waffling on the fringe, and of course, Rand Paul is Rand Paul. To me, this does not appear to be a major fracture at all within the Republican ranks. As a matter of fact, I thought my friend Pete Hegseth was outstanding in dressing down some of the Democrats on the House Armed Services Committee the other day when he hit them for calling this a quagmire. But I think there's solidarity among the Republican ranks. I'm not really overly concerned about that. We're a little concerned about gas prices. I know the president is monitoring those really, really closely, but I think right now we're good in the Congress.
I'd like to get your perspective on the administration's argument that this war in Iran is virtually over, given that we're currently in a ceasefire and the ceasefire is holding. And so the argument is, well, we're not really up against that 60-day deadline because there hasn't been any firing since the ceasefire started and the war is virtually over. Are you buying that?
Well, I mean, the military operations are primarily over. We're not hitting them right now. The president may resume. I understand he's considering that now. A naval blockade is in place. The war is not as active or as kinetic as it was back on March 1st, for sure. And of course, there have always been questions about the constitutionality of the War Powers Act, which is where the 60-day deadline comes from. Every president since Nixon, since the act was passed, has challenged its constitutionality. So it's an interesting argument. But I think it's going to be moot anyway, because I think the Republican Congress would extend authorization for military action under it anyway.
Okay.
Well, the Israeli Navy has intercepted more than 20 Gaza-bound flotilla ships carrying about 175 activists. Israel's foreign ministry says the operation was peaceful with no casualties and was needed to prevent a breach of the Gaza blockade. The global flotilla called the interception an act of piracy in international waters. Israel says the flotilla was Hamas-backed provocation, not a humanitarian mission. So what's your take?
Well, the law of the high seas under the United Nations Conference on the Law of the High Seas, although the U.S. is not a member of that, certainly recognizes the right to intercept piracy on the high seas. And I think Israel is well within its rights under international law if it considers threatened in that situation. And not surprised they're trying to break that. This thing in Hamas has been going on for years, but I think Israel's in pretty solid shape there. You never know what the UN is going to do with Israel. They will sanction them just for blinking their eye the wrong way. But I think they're on solid ground, Dr. G, internationally.
Don, I want to ask you about just the crisis that we're in terms of gas. So especially the stalemate we're in over the Strait of Hormuz. So how close are we really to choking Iran financially? Because we obviously know you mentioned the military operations seem to be largely accomplished. But economically speaking, how much longer till we make them cry uncle? And what do you make of the UAE leaving OPEC? And what does that do for oil markets?
Well, first of all, there is a million-dollar question. How long is it going to take? Clearly, the blockade is affecting their ability to get their oil out. Apparently, a few ships have slipped by, but it's been largely affected. There's this theory that the whole pipelines are about to bust because they've got no place to ship the oil out. We hope that it's going to be sooner than later. UAE obviously is not happy with OPEC. I don't think that the disintegration of OPEC is a bad thing at all for the United States of America. We'll see how that goes, but I think it's a crack in the armor for sure. But I do believe probably that by the middle or the end of June, this thing is going to be at a resolution, hopefully.
Let's kind of broaden the scope, if you will. Much of our focus, particularly in the media right now, is on the situation there in Iran. But Russia, Ukraine is still ongoing. China is always going to be an actor, a nefarious actor. North Korea also always going to be a nefarious actor. Are we spreading ourselves a little too thin right now, do you think?
Well, Terrance, you described the old axis of evil, I believe as George W. was called, or maybe it was Reagan. Are we spreading ourselves too thin? I had an op-ed come out earlier this week about, the U.S. Navy's got to build ships. This is one of the reasons the Secretary of Navy was relieved, because the president's shipbuilding effort hasn't accelerated like they wanted it to. Right now, we've got about 271, naval combatants on the high seas. China is at 400. We've fallen behind. It's taken us forever to build ships here in the United States. We used to build about 7 ships a week during World War II. Now we're down to it takes us about 5 years to build one. We have to be concerned about that. I believe we are restocking our munitions according to the War Department, so we got to get those cruise missiles and other missiles restocked. But it certainly is a concern. I'm not sure that we have a number of hulls in the water to combat adversaries on multiple fronts like we did in World War II. We've got to re-expand the size of the Navy for one thing. So I am concerned about that. If something were to break out. On the other hand, Donald Trump is in the White House. China's not going to try anything with Taiwan while Donald Trump's in the White House, and Russia is not going to go any farther than they've already gone, because unlike the Obama and Biden years, we don't have weakness in Pennsylvania Avenue. So, but beyond that, we gotta look at rebuilding our military short term and long term, and especially the Navy, in my opinion.
So, Don, just quickly before we go, I know you mentioned end of June. Do you think we start to see some of these gas prices that are affecting obviously middle and low income Americans by end of June, summer?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. The president is a political genius. We would never really see anything like him on the American landscape. He understands that going into midterms, you've got to hold the House to avoid frivolous impeachments. Frivolous, and I emphasize that impeachments would come if they take control of the House. And the president is smart enough to understand that gasoline prices are the most visible, sign to Americans as to where we are economically. Yeah. If we can get these prices back down about $1, I think we'll be in good shape. And the president's going to have to wind it down at some point in order to get us there. And I think that he will. All
right, Don Brown. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, sir. Have a great afternoon. Okay.
My honor. Have a great weekend.
All right. Coming up.